Hi, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology. And today we'll be continuing with our lecture on the African American experience, part two, focusing on the civil rights movement to today. Welcome back again. So we're going to start here with the civil rights movement. So we ended the last lecture with lynch law, which basically lasted through 1890s. It kind of died down a bit and then came back again in the 1920s and 1930s. Died down again a bit in the 1940s. And then after the wars, the thing is, when people, in World War I, there was a deliberate policy not to allow African Americans to participate in any combat roles, or at least there was an attempt to do this. Keep in mind that the Army was very Southern dominated, particularly the Army officer corps, because there were no other jobs in the South for gentlemen but going into the Army. And so they were very, very, opposed to any form of integration. The Army was segregated, the U.S. Army, there was up until the 1950s. So up until then, blacks in the Army, for the most part, were segregated into supply units or logistics units, which are obviously very important units for the war effort. Also engineering units, like building roads, building bridges, supplying, driving trucks. So these were important jobs, but deliberately not jobs where you could be easily noted for valor. You weren't on the front lines. Very few blacks fought on the front lines in either war. In World War I, however, there were some black regiments that were put with French divisions because Pershing, who was the American commander, knew that no American officer wanted black troops in their sector. Right? So he lent them to the French, and they did extremely well, and of course the French were not nearly as racist at that time, at least, as Americans were, right? So in the Second World War, there was more fighting units, the Tuskegee Airmen you may have heard of, and you may have also heard of other units, African American soldiers fighting in the front lines. But again, in segregated units, typically, African Americans were not eligible for officer status, so all the officers would be white, and so on and so forth. So after World War II, again, there was another backlash because when whites had gone to war, a lot of their jobs were taken by women and by black people, right? African Americans. When whites came back from the war, they took those jobs back. So basically, that implied a period of racial suppression of African Americans. But the United States was not in the same position. First of all, they just fought a war that ostensibly had been all about, or at least in part, about race, right? About defeating the Germans and their supposed super race ideology, right? And how terrible the Germans are because they picked on Jews and they picked on gypsies and they were so racist. But yet in the United States, you had this entire structure of racism. So it was difficult. And the federal government under Truman at that time, Roosevelt had already done some things to promote black military units, but they were still segregated. Truman finally desegregated the Army. And again, this set off a whole wave of repercussions and reactions, primarily in the South. And it was in this context that what we call the civil rights movement emerged. To tell you the truth, it actually been a long time coming. The NAACP was formed in the beginning of the 1900s in Niagara Falls, and they had been fighting legally for many, many years, bringing attention to lynch law, bringing attention to inequality, to the insanity of Plessy versus Ferguson. And they had been bringing case after case to the Supreme Court to try to show that Plessy versus Ferguson was a flawed law that had to be overturned. And finally, in 1955, in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court agreed. And they basically overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. They overturned the doctrine of separate but equal. Right? Now, this is something that very rarely happens in court doctrine. It's very difficult for the court to basically say the previous court was completely wrong, right? We got it right. Now, one reason for this is, remember, Roosevelt had been president for 14, 15 years, and then you had Truman, who was also a Democrat, president. So you had 20 years of Democratic presidency. And as I said before, the Democrats in the South were the party of segregation. But in the North, the Democrats were much more liberal. And remember, Roosevelt and Truman were both Northern Democrats, right? So they said no problem. They saw no problem with appointing justices who were much more liberal. And between the two of them, over 20 years, they appointed 8 members of the Supreme Court, 8 out of 9, right? So basically, they at that point had appointed the vast majority, almost all the Supreme Court members. So they had changed the entire composition of the Supreme Court to one that now admitted, look, we made this huge mistake, or the Supreme Court made this huge mistake back in the 1800s. So when they did this, now, it didn't actually overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Initially, it just applied to schools. And basically, the Supreme Court said you cannot have equal schools if they're segregated because, you know, by human nature, people are going to put more resources where their children go, right? So basically, they said you have to allow schools to be integrated. And then this was put into practice very slowly, I should add, over the next couple of years. And of course, instantly became a political hot potato, particularly in the South. So politicians running for re-election, because of all the white people, of course, were angry about this. All the politicians basically had to go along with this and pretend also or be segregationists. So you had many governors who were, one might say, in a way, desegregationists. They had earlier argued that schools should be desegregated, but in the face of this furor, popular backlash from white citizens, they all became fervent segregationists. One governor, when he lost an election to an opponent, because the opponent accused him of being soft on segregation, he said, "I will never be out-end again," using the N-word. Right? Basically, he said, "I'll be just as racist. I'm going to be more racist than the other guy in order to win the election." Right? So this created a violent situation in the South. It wasn't black people demanding to be segregated that caused the violence. It was white people fighting the desegregation. Now this then, of course, did move things in a certain direction. African Americans realized they would have to themselves organize to force desegregation, that they could not rely solely on the federal government. And of course they had to expand it. So for example, buses, lunch counters, freedom rides, voting rights, all of these became central to the civil rights movement. And this was not done easily. There was a huge amount of white violence in reaction, killings, lynchings, and of course just beatings, just riots, white riots, killing people, smashing stores. So anybody who talks about violence or racial violence, you got to look at the 60s and look at what white people were doing in the South, destroying things. Even police officers beating people up on a regular basis in front of TV cameras. it made a spectacle. And a couple other things happened too that were very significant. Whites fled areas. They tried to create all-white suburbs. So rather than living in cities next to black people, they would move out so they could have their own schools and their own neighborhoods without black people around. Because the Democratic Party had led the shift to desegregation, the Republican Party, which is the paradox, the Republican Party had always been the party of civil rights, and in fact, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than Democrats did, but yet because the Democrat president was at that point Johnson, the Republicans grabbed on this as a political strategy, and they converted the Southern Democratic Party into the Southern Republican Party. This is part of what we call Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968 and 1972. So for the first time since the Civil War, Republicans suddenly started winning congressional seats and Senate seats in the South because they were adopting the program of the Southern Democratic Party as the Democratic Party was leaving it behind. I hope that makes sense to you. If not, please repeat. So why did it happen? As I said, there were macro sociological factors. There were changes in the economy. African Americans in the war had been fighting in the war. They'd been working in wartime industries, sometimes for the first time. The U.S. had become the leader of the free world. We were leading the UN, and the federal government was doing this by proclaiming itself as a democracy, as a haven of racial equality. And here you had in the South this system where if you were black, you couldn't vote, you didn't have any rights, you couldn't go to the same schools. So there was that pressure to try to improve things, put it that way. There were also the micro-sociological factors or meso-sociological factors. As I said, the role of the NAACP in constantly challenging equality over 50, 60 years, the role of the civil rights movement itself, the people themselves who came out. And that isn't easy because you'd had a century of black people being terrorized into hiding. So to come out and say we're not afraid, even though you might get beaten, you might be killed, that was an incredibly courageous thing to do. Justice Warren Burger and the Supremes, as I said, the Democrat, Roosevelt and Truman had appointed 8 members of the Supreme Court up to that point. And they had appointed people who were neutral on the issue of race or slightly progressive on the issue of race, and they simply could not condone this separate but equal thing. And then, of course, you have leaders like Martin Luther King. I mean, I'm not going to go into it, his role, but for whatever you might say about Martin Luther King, he was a person who stood up at the moment, and that's a very brave thing to do. He had other individual moments also of braveness. You had when Eisenhower stood up to the governor of Arkansas and said, I'm not going to allow you to overthrow the federal government, which is essentially what the governor of Arkansas said. It's like, federal law does not apply here. It's like, I'm sorry, you're in the United States of America. And Eisenhower sent in the troops. So that, again, was a brave thing to do. Not as brave as Martin Luther King, maybe not as brave as the people, the young people who joined the Freedom Rides and risked being killed or burnt to death, as some were in buses trying to desegregate the bus system in the South. But certainly political bravery, because we see many politicians today who basically do whatever they think people want or whatever they think is the easiest way to get reelected without even a thought about the Constitution or what it means. So what is the legacy of the civil rights? Well, certainly the civil rights movement did not abolish slavery. It has changed things. It did not abolish slavery, but it has to admit overt racism continued throughout the 1970s, and I would say the 1980s, as somebody who grew up during that period. It began, in a certain sense, people say there was a political correctness. You couldn't say certain things. Well, I have to say that luckily many institutions adopted policies of saying we're not going to tolerate racist language, we're not going to tolerate racist behavior, because they could get sued, right? Or they could lose federal money. So they basically said we're not going to tolerate it anymore because it's not good for business. So if you're a racist, keep your racist ideas to yourself, right? Or if you're going to work for us, keep your racism at home. Don't mix your racism with work. That's not political correctness. That's just proper business sense, right? There was also the Southern strategy. We have a reality where the Republican Party in the South adopted much of the racist ideology of the Southern Democratic Party. Again, not in whole, not completely, but think about this. Between the Civil War and the 1950s, the Southern Republican Party was almost universally black, right? It was minority black people in the Southern Republican Party, and that switched, right? So there was, I believe, in 1964, I believe, there was a Dixiecrat party where the Southern Democrats split under Strom Thurmond. He was presidential candidate, and he split. He formed his own party for a year, and then the next year, basically, he joined the Republican Party, and he brought the South with him, or at least the Southern, the racism of the South. So I don't say this lightly. I mean, I'm not saying that these people are necessarily evil people. In their minds, they're just upholding a system of privilege that they think is innate, right? Because they grew up with it, right? And that takes a long time to overcome. And this is the problem. Over time, these things have not disappeared. That latent racism is still there and comes up during times of crises. And in a way, people like when, for example, Barack Obama was elected, this really galvanized a lot of people. Again, those fears of being ruled by black people, etc., really came back in their heads and reignited, if nothing else, a lot of these racist conditions. Are conditions better? Well, again, African Americans are still disadvantaged in almost every single area because of this legacy of racism. It's not a 5-year, 10-year, 50-year, it's a 500-year legacy of racism. It continued through slavery, through Jim Crow, through post-Jim Crow, even up to the 1980s. There were significant differences in the way African Americans and whites were treated in terms of applications to schools, applications for housing, and things like that. And then Southern racism still goes on, even today, right? So, for example, in studies where they send out CVs with black people, picture on it, a white person's picture on it, the white person is going to get the interview 9 times out of 10. So in all of these areas, conditions have not significantly improved. So let's just show you a few. What is the reality of being African American today? African American households have on average about 10% of the wealth of white households. Remember, wealth is something you inherit. You either inherit it directly or indirectly through privileges, through better education and things like that. So this is a powerful symbol or evidence of the history of racism. Unemployment rate is consistently 3 times higher for African Americans than for whites. So when unemployment for whites is 5, it's 15% for African Americans. When it's 10 for whites, it's 30% for African Americans. Black males are almost 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white males. You're much more likely to be stopped or harassed by police or even non-police if you are black. You are much more likely to be suspected of a crime, prosecuted for a crime, and convicted of a crime, and sentenced to prison for a crime, with the result that you're 4 times more likely to spend time in prison over your lifetime than if you are white. Just some very brief, I'm not going to spend too much time on these things, but just to show you the difference here. So in people have households that have almost no wealth, only a few of those, 9% are white, 22% are black. When you look at the top of the scale, people have over $500,000 wealth. Again, most of those are white. And this is from the 2000, by the way. And when you look at people basically in the upper middle classes, again, you see a massive difference between white and other races. Unemployment, as I said, is almost consistently 3 times higher for African Americans than whites. Lifetime risk of being killed by police, as you can see here, it's about 2 or 3 times higher if you're African American. And this is an interesting chart that shows the percentage of minorities versus whites in prison between 1950 and 2010. And if you look at the statistics here, you see that in 1950, most of the people in prison were white. 2/3 were white, only 1/3 were minority. Whereas when you look at the statistics basically today, you got the exact opposite. 2/3 are minorities and 1/3 are white. So what has happened is that the prison population has massively increased. We talked about that in the section on crime and deviance. But most of the new people being thrown in jail are blacks and minorities. Overall, mostly black, right? So why are we punishing blacks more today than we were in 1950 during the heyday, as it were, of racial segregation? Because then we could punish blacks through lynch law or through other forms of segregation, that is, we as in whites. Right? Whereas today, those things are no longer possible. You no longer have lynch law, you no longer have the ability to segregate, so instead, blacks are being punished through the legal justice system at far higher rates than whites are being punished. Certainly this punishment is at least not as devastating as lynch law in its extrajudicial nature. But still, this shows that there's still a very high degree of racism in the system today. Now, I'm sorry, we couldn't be more optimistic about solutions to these problems. As you can see, sometimes we have problems where it's a problem of the attitude of people. It's very hard to change these things. Even when you pass a law, people will find ways around the law, or ways to ignore the law, or ways to do things in their own way anyway. So, look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.